Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for joining the 15th Islamic course 2023. There are 10 sessions in total, and if you attend 70% of the course, you will be awarded a certificate of participation. Would you kindly rename your Zoom name to your full name for attendance taking purposes? Today is the 7th session, and it will be on Islam in China, presented by Professor James Frankel, sorry. He is a native New Yorker and is an expert in the history of Islam in China. He holds postgraduate degrees in religion from Columbia University and has published a book on Chinese Islamic scholarship. His research interests include comparative religion, Chinese religions, Sufism, and religious fundamentalisms. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you, Anissa. Good afternoon, everyone, and salam alaikum. You'll have to forgive me. My voice is a little bit, my throat is a little bit sore today, so I hope you can hear me. We have a very long program today. I'm going to try to fit in a lot of information, so I'm just going to get started, and hopefully, inshallah, we will have time for some questions afterwards if anything comes up to you. So let's begin with the PowerPoint. I found this slide on the internet, referring to China's forgotten Muslims. And in fact, even with the information that is coming out and the interest in stories about Xinjiang and about Islam in China, I do think that there's a lot of information that people should know in order to understand the historical background of what's happening today. So today we're actually going to be having a kind of historical survey of Islam in China, beginning with the origins of Islam in China, and moving forward, hopefully we'll get to discuss what's happening right now as well. So the period that we're going to is actually the earliest period of contact between Muslims and China. Well, actually, even the pre-Islamic Arabs had contact with China, and they were already doing trade with China through the South China Sea as far back as the late 5th or early 6th century. So the Arabs were already in China, and then when Islam came and the Arabs became Muslims, then Muslims came to China. But if you look at this map here that I'm showing you, you can see that actually the Chinese state and the Islamic Caliphate, the Chinese Empire and the Islamic Caliphate, actually came into contact with each other in terms of territory, geographically, as well as Islam spread to the east, and Chinese power was also spreading westward into Central Asia. Now, of course, there's a very famous hadith, which some people say is authentic, other people say is not, but the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is reported to have said, "Seek knowledge even if you have to go to China." So if this hadith reflects the knowledge of the Arabs at the time, they thought of China as being someplace very remote, someplace almost like the end of the earth, and you would have to go there to get something valuable or precious like knowledge. So that just shows you that China was not someplace that most of the Arabs knew from firsthand experience either. So in the earliest time, let's look at the nature of relations between China and the Islamic world. Chinese Islamic engagement came in 4 different types. The first is commercial, trade. Then there was diplomatic engagement and relations between, as I said, the Islamic Caliphate and the Tang Empire in the earliest instance. And then there was an instance or two of military confrontation, and then also military cooperation. And then finally, we have a broader category of cultural engagement, which continued well beyond that early period. So the Silk Road, what we call the Silk Road, which is actually many different, it's a network of different roads, both overland and by sea, connected Arabia to China. And as you can see, it would have also connected, this network goes all the way from the Mediterranean and from the Roman Empire, all the way eastward into China. And the overland routes passed through Central Asia, where Islam was spreading by land. And so these trade routes were really important for the transmission of ideas and also of goods for trade, and also people. And so when we think about the exchanges, the cultural exchanges, they actually go back to these commercial exchanges. You know, there were commodities that China had, like silk, like tea, and like ceramics, like porcelain, that the rest of the world valued and treasured. And then on the other hand, there were other material resources that were brought into China, and also cultural trends and fashions that were brought into China from the West. So these two pieces are a good example. On the left side of your screen, this is a Tang Dynasty ceramic urn or pitcher, and the imagery of it, or the style of it, is very much like a Central Asian or Persian metal pitcher from the same period. And this shows you that the fashions of China were also affected by trade with the Central Asian West. And also this color blue that's in the glaze, that comes from cobalt that was only available at that time in Central Asia. And even on the right side of the screen, much later in the Ming Dynasty, these masterpieces of Chinese porcelain, the famous Ming blue and white vase, that blue also could not have been available were it not for trade with the Muslim world. And as I said, ideas and people also traveled on the Silk Road. So the Silk Road was the means of conveyance of a lot of different religious ideas. One of the earliest imports from Central Asia to China was Buddhism. And when these religions arrived in China, they had to sort of adapt to the local intellectual, philosophical, and religious environment. So Buddhism actually became a kind of localized, almost indigenous religion in China. And it existed alongside the two indigenous traditions of Confucianism and Taoism. So any new religion that entered China would have to kind of engage with these three teachings. And that includes when the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all entered China. They had to sort of adapt to actually the ideological domination of Confucianism in particular. So once again, this is a map of the Tang Dynasty in the period that we're talking. 618 to 906 is the length of that dynasty. And I put a little red star, as you can see, at the Chinese capital, the Tang capital of Chang'an. But also you can see that the Tang Dynasty had a lot of influence and stretched all the way into what we might now call Turkish Central Asia, Turkestan. And so now those people were not Muslim yet. They converted to Islam later in history. But nevertheless, this was a point of contact because Islamic influence was also stretching eastward into the same region. And so because of trade and these other contacts, there were a lot of foreigners living in Tang Dynasty China. As I said, the Arabs and Persians had already been there since the 5th or 6th century. But when they lived in China, when they came to China for trade, they were required to live segregated from the general population. So there wasn't that much first-hand contact between ordinary Chinese people and these foreigners. And the foreigners included Jews, Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, and Muslims. And there were hundreds of thousands of Muslims by the 9th century. The diplomatic aspect, as I said, foreign emissaries, ambassadors would come and visit the Tang court, and coming from all different neighboring countries to pay tribute to the Tang emperor. And so I want to talk about the emperor who would have been the most relevant at the time. I mean, while some of the Chinese Muslim records speak of Islam coming earlier, the earliest written document that we have that confirms the visit of Muslim diplomats is during the period of the Emperor Gaozong, he reigned from 649 to 683, which is contemporaneous with the early part of the Islamic Caliphate. So this would have been at the same time, roughly, as the first four caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, and then also the beginning of the Umayyad Caliphate after the death of Ali. Nevertheless, as I mentioned briefly, there are stories that Islam may have come even earlier during the reign of the predecessor of Gaozong, the Emperor Taizong. But you see his years, 626 to 649, makes it really early in Islamic history. And yet there is a very famous story that is circulated and told among Chinese Muslims. And it's told in different versions. There are different narrative forms, but the story goes something like this, that the Emperor Taizong was sleeping in his palace one night and he had a dream. And in that dream, he perceived that a monster or some kind of evil force was coming to destroy his kingdom. And then suddenly appeared a man in a green turban. And this man, through his prayers, was able to destroy that evil monster. And when the emperor woke up, he asked his ministers, "What is the meaning of this dream?" And one of them said that there is a great sage who has been born in the West, and he can help to save our empire. So the story says that the emperor then dispatched his own emissaries to go to the far West. And they eventually reached a place called Tianfang, which we now it's called Arabia in the Western sources. And there they met this man with the green turban, and they asked him to please come to China. And he said, "Well, I cannot come myself, but I will send my companions to go and help you and bring peace to your country." And so the story is that one of the Prophet Muhammad's companions, actually his cousin, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, led this delegation from Arabia to China, where he met the emperor and where he spread the message of peace of Islam. And the Chinese emperor allowed him to stay in China. He and his fellow companions, and they married Chinese women and they established a Chinese Muslim community there. So not far from here in Hong Kong, if you go to the city of Guangzhou, there is a compound where there's a grave, there's a burial site, which is supposedly the grave site of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas and some other early companions. He is also said to have built the first mosque in China, which is also in the city of Guangzhou. It's called the Huaishang Mosque, or the Mosque of embracing the or commemorating the Prophet. But in this early history, it wasn't only peaceful engagement. There is one instance, as I said, because of the geographic confrontation or connection of the Abbasid Caliphate and Tang China. There was one battle where the two territories met, which is in present-day Kyrgyzstan, in the place called Talas, the river Talas. And there was a battle between the Tang army and the Caliphate army. And actually the Caliphate, the Abbasids, won that day, but it was a very hard-fought battle, and the Arab Muslim armies did not continue further. So this really established the, I guess you could say, the political boundary between the Chinese Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. On that day, one popular story is that that the Arab armies captured some Chinese artisans who were experts in making paper. Paper was a technology that only existed in China, but when the Arab armies brought these men into the caliphate, that's when paper making became a widespread technology also in the Muslim world. So this brings us to the next stage in history, which is the Song dynasty, specifically the Northern Song dynasty, when Muslims began to visit other cities in China besides the capital and besides Guangzhou. And this is also a period of greater, I guess you could say, greater assimilation, because Muslims were no longer required to live in those segregated foreign neighborhoods. And so they did spread more, and they did have greater contact with the local Chinese population, especially in terms of intermarriage, because some Muslims remained in China and they started families there. And that you really could say is the historically the beginning of the Chinese Muslim population, this kind of hybrid population, which is half foreign Muslim and half Chinese and their descendants. And then after the Song dynasty, if we know the history, the Mongols came from the north and invaded China, but they also, of course, invaded far westward, so that China, the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols, became connected to the Mongols' entire world empire, which, as you can see, it spreads all the way into the Middle East, all the way into Eastern Europe. So from Korea all the way to Austria, the Mongols ruled that large territory. And this meant that there was traffic of goods, but also a steady migration of people from east to west and from west to east. And this included a lot of Muslims, because most of the Mongol Empire went through territories where Muslims were the majority population. Now, after the Mongols were defeated in China, the Yuan dynasty was replaced by a native Chinese dynasty called the Ming. And the Ming, this period is very important in the history of Islam in China, because it's a period where Muslims really had to develop their own culture and their own lifestyles, because they were cut off from relations with Muslims outside of China. The Ming dynasty, because it was so afraid of invasion after a whole period, a whole century of Mongolian domination, they actually became quite closed, and there was much less contact between Chinese and the outside world. There were exceptions, however. In the second emperor's reign of the Yongle emperor, he had a Muslim friend and minister whom he appointed as an admiral to lead a great fleet from Ming China all the way through the Indian Ocean, reaching the eastern coast of Africa, and along the way visiting many, many different communities for trade and commerce and also diplomacy. So we could take a quick look at the map, and you see that his travels brought him all the way into Southeast Asia, brought him to India, and it is said that he and his crew visited Mecca as well. And this is the period where we could start to talk about a distinctly Chinese form of Islam, what we might say Islam with Chinese characteristics, much like this calligraphy on the bottom, which is, you might recognize it as Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, but you probably wouldn't be able to recognize this style of calligraphy. It is a distinctly Chinese style using a Chinese calligraphy brush. So that shows you the combination or the synthesis of cultures. Now, for a lot of people in China, even today, they would think that the thing that distinguishes Muslims from ordinary Chinese is not only their belief, not only their religion, but habits like not eating pork. But of course, that's just one small aspect of what it means to be a Muslim. But this idea that somehow Islam was set apart and different from Chinese mainstream culture and society is really kind of summarized in these two characters, Qing Zhen. Qing Zhen literally means pure and true. And this is the name that Chinese Muslims give to their own religion, to Islam. And it also has the meaning, something similar to halal. This idea of purity and truth is the self-identity of Muslims who, in many cases, have been stereotyped or stigmatized by Chinese culture as being alien and foreign and really too different to be easily absorbed into the Chinese mainstream. Nevertheless, during this Ming period, beginning in the 14th century, there was a lot of assimilation. As I said, Muslims were largely cut off from contact with other Muslims outside of China. And so for convenience and also to kind of fit into society, they made certain cultural gestures and compromises. And one of these was changing from having foreign names to taking on Chinese surnames. And as you know, in Chinese, surnames are usually just one character. So a long Arabic name or Persian name like Mahmud or Jalaluddin might be reduced to something like Ma or Ding, right? Like Jalaluddin becomes Ding, or Abu Safar becomes just Bu or Pu. So this is why a lot of Chinese Muslims today have Chinese names. And we've already seen the cultural influence and also the trade of resources. But now you see that even Chinese art forms, there are examples of Chinese art forms that also show Islamic influence or Muslim patronage, like this blue and white vase from the, or this incense burner from the Ming Dynasty, or this cloisonné burner, this for incense also. And as you can see, it says La ilaha illallah. There were also some other distinctive features that developed in Chinese Islam, which we don't find in other parts of the Muslim world. One example is the establishment of women's only mosques only for women, where women are the congregation and where a woman leads the prayer and also is the teacher for women. So women imams and women mosques are something that developed also in the Ming period. Mostly not to segregate women from men for Islamic religious reasons, but mostly because the Chinese culture at the time, influenced by teachings from Confucianism, also restricted or discouraged the mixing of men and women together in public spaces. And so I look at this period as a period of reorganization of the Muslim community, from being a foreign community to a localized Chinese Muslim community. And that means that this community is going to feel different tensions or different pressures. So any diaspora or immigrant community has to make this choice. They have to ask themselves, are we going to remain different, or are we going to assimilate? And I'm not saying that this is always a conscious decision, but it takes place within the community. And some members of the community will tend towards assimilation, becoming more like the mainstream population around them. And this can lead to integration, but it can also lead to absorption, where they lose their own distinctive identity. On the other hand, if they want to remain different, This can lead to segregation and even ghettoization, where they cannot relate easily to the local population. And so these two poles can lead to, in the case of Chinese Muslims, either the phenomenon of Sinicization, becoming Chinese, or further Islamization. That means basically staying Muslim, but also alienating themselves from outside. Oh, this is just another slide showing you the Qingjian, these two words, pure and true, because this becomes one of the factors in deciding how much you can assimilate in order to, but still remain pure and true to your religious and cultural identity. So this brings us to the situation. This is the situation in Ming Dynasty China, where Muslims had become so assimilated that they only spoke Chinese. They had become a Chinese Muslim community. Their education was in Chinese. In fact, if you were from the upper class of Muslim society in China, you probably received a Confucian education. You learned how to read and write classical Chinese. And your Muslim education might be restricted to very basic classes in the local mosque under the local imam. And you might learn how to read Quran, or to at least to recite. You'd learn very basic Islamic knowledge. And so in the 16th century, there was a man called Hu Dengzhou, and Hu Dengzhou lived in the Shanxi province near the city of Xi'an. And he had gone through this kind of education that I just described to you. He was educated in his local mosque, and he was also educated in the Confucian Chinese curriculum. But he wasn't satisfied with the level of his Islamic education. He wanted more knowledge. And so he did something which at the time was actually quite risky. He embarked on a trip outside of China. Very few people did that during this period of Chinese history. So he went westward through Central Asia, where he stopped in the city of Bukhara, present-day Uzbekistan. And then he traveled even farther until he reached Mecca. And along the way in Mecca, in Bukhara, he studied with Islamic scholars and Sufi masters, and he gathered books. And he brought all of this information back to China, where he began to try to educate his fellow Muslims in Islamic knowledge. And this resulted in the translation of many Islamic texts into Chinese. And then eventually, in future generations, Chinese Muslim scholars who could now read Arabic and Persian once again, and who had access to these important texts coming from the central Muslim world, they developed a body of literature, first translations, and then commentaries on those translations, and then original books about Islam. And collectively, this whole body of texts came to be known as the Han Kitab. Han meaning Chinese, and Kitab, of course, the Arabic word for book. So these are Islamic books written in Chinese. And this brings us into the Qing dynasty. So this new Chinese Muslim education system developed in the late Ming period, and it continued to spread even after the Ming Empire was defeated and replaced by a dynasty that actually came from outside of China, from the north, and was ruled by Manchurian leaders, the Qing dynasty. And it's during this period, the late Ming and the early Qing, that we see the emergence of these scholars who might rightfully be called Confucian Muslims, or Muslim Confucians, however you want to arrange the words. But they are Confucian educated and also scholars of Islam. And these became the authors of those Han Kitab books. And here are some of the most famous ones from the late Ming period into the early Qing dynasty. And one might say maybe the finest product, the most famous of these scholars, was actually from the period he was born in around 660 and died around 730. His name is Liu Zhi, and Liu Zhi was a native of Nanjing. So he came from a very cosmopolitan city, very well-educated man, and he became one of the famous writers of these Han Kitab books. And one of his books, called Tianfang Dianli, or the Ritual Law of Arabia, tells you exactly what his intention was, and it tells you what the Han Kitab in general were doing. So he says this, he says, the ritual of the pure and true, remember Qingzhen, pure and true, comes from the teaching of the Arabian sage. The Arabian sage, of course, is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Yet, even though it comes from Arabia, it agrees in many ways with the ritual of the Confucians. Therefore, I have frequently explained the points of this matter by using originally Confucian language to elucidate the meaning, wishing only that the people of this land, meaning people in China, to know what I have explained. So he's using Confucian language to explain Islam. He also wrote this about the relationship of Islam and Confucianism. He said, the sage of the West, Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, was born after Confucius and lived in Arabia. He was so far removed in time and space from the Chinese sages that we do not even know exactly by how much. The language they spoke are mutually unintelligible. How is it then that their ways are in full accord? The answer is they were of one mind. Thus, their way is the same. So he's really saying, if you read this passage, he's saying that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and Confucius, who lived in ancient China, actually their teachings agree with each other, and that they share the same mind, and that they share the same way. And way, of course, in Chinese is the Dao. They share the same Dao, which means they have the same understanding of the nature of the universe. It's a very, very bold statement. Now, you may ask, what about the Quran in China? Well, these Muslim scholars, of course, they read the Quran, and people prayed and worshipped in exactly the same way as most Muslims do today. But there was no complete translation of the Quran until the modern period. These Chinese Muslim scholars, whether it was because of respect for the Quran or the idea that the Quran cannot be translated into a foreign language other than Arabic, they did not translate the Quran, although they quoted from passages of the Quran. So they translated small parts. And also, when the Quran was taught, it was often taught using Chinese to help explain. So here you can see a Quranic text with Chinese notes. There were other forms as well, like passages from the Quran and how to pronounce it using using Chinese characters, and also a brief commentary or brief translation of these lines of text. The same thing here. You have both the meaning and then also how to pronounce the Arabic using Chinese characters as a simulation. So we do see that these Chinese scholars did translate small portions of the Quran in their texts. And then a scholar in the late Qing period, Ma Dexin, tried to translate the whole text, but he died before he completed it. And so it really wasn't until 1927 that we see the first complete translation of the Quran into Chinese, and then we have these other translations all the way up to the 1950s. So Ma Jian's translation is the one that is circulated today in the People's Republic of China. So this leaves us with this is really the introduction to how Islam arrived and developed in China. And this is now the distribution. You see, Muslims live throughout China. In some areas, they live in higher concentration, and then in other areas, like here in Hong Kong or in Guangdong province, a lower concentration. But there are Muslims in China virtually everywhere in every province. We also see that Sufism was introduced to China during the Qing dynasty, specifically Sufi orders, Sufi groups coming from Central Asia, like the Naqshbandi Sufi tariqa or brotherhood. And when it arrived in China, it arrived in two different branches, one called the Khafiya, the other called the Jahriya, and they were distinguished by the way that they performed their dhikr or remembrance of Allah. So the Khafiya were the ones who said you should do it silently. The Jahriya said no, it should be loud and almost like lively. And these two groups actually came to disagree with each other and actually came to fight against each other in China. So here are some images of Sufis. In the lower right corner, you can see the kind of tower or pagoda. That's what's called a gongbei, and that is the Chinese transliteration of kubba. Kubba meaning the domed mausoleum of a Sufi sheikh, Sufi master, is buried there. And then in the late Qing period, we also have history of Muslims rebelling against the empire. But in most cases, these rebellions that took place in the 19th century were really, they began as disputes between Muslim groups. And then it spread to the larger community of non-Muslims. And then the empire had to send armies in to try to put down these rebellions. But unfortunately, during this period, Muslims also started to receive a very bad reputation in China as being violent and aggressive. So these are a few of the rebellions. Several of them were led by Chinese-speaking Muslims, and then there was also a rebellion led by Uyghur people. I'm going to explain these designations in just a minute. And then when the Qing Empire ended, it was replaced, of course, by the more modern nation state of the Republic of China. And the Republic of China tried to resolve or reconcile the differences between different ethnic, linguistic, and cultural groups and religious groups by saying that there should be just one Chinese nationality. Everyone should just consider themselves citizens of China, and that the 5 races, as they called it, should live together. And this included Han Chinese, Manchurians, Mongolians, Muslims, and Tibetans. So during this period, you can see the distribution once again of Muslim population. And in 1935, the estimated number of Muslims living throughout the Republic of China was 35 million. And then more recently in 2020, in the People's Republic of China, the official number is now 25 million. And it's very hard to explain that if these numbers are accurate, because the overall population of China has increased more than 4 times since 1935. And yet the Muslim population has decreased according to these statistics. So either people don't identify as Muslim, or they have lost their Muslim identity somehow, or they're not being counted, or there has been a reduction in the population. So we don't actually know exactly how large the Muslim population in China is today, but it is estimated to be somewhere between 20 and 30 million right now. Now, with the Republic of China, China became more open. And therefore, Muslims, for the first time in many centuries, were free to go and travel, and that included the ability to perform pilgrimage to Mecca. It also meant that certain Muslim students were able to receive an Islamic education in some of the great centers of Muslim education, like Al-Azhar University in Cairo, Egypt. One of those scholars coined the phrase, which might be quite famous today in China, 爱国爱教. 爱教, or 爱国, love the country, 爱教, love your religion. And this was a way of saying that you can be a patriot in the progress of China while also being faithful to Islam. But the influences coming from the Muslim world were very diverse. And so the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia, because of course people had to go to Mecca to perform their pilgrimage, therefore they encountered some of these Muslim movements and revival or reform movements, or might even call them fundamentalist movements. And that came to influence some Muslims in China as well. But overall, if we look at the history that we've just documented, we see the transformation of a community from a diaspora, right, immigrants, who then intermarried, assimilated, became naturalized, became more Chinese until they were simultaneously Muslim and Chinese. And this creates what we call the Hui population, right? Muslims who speak Chinese, Muslims who appear Chinese, and are in fact a blend or a hybridization of Chinese and foreign elements. Just a few slides to show you Hui people. As you can see, in many ways indistinguishable from Han Chinese or the majority Chinese population, unless they have markers that show their religion, like the calligraphy in this family's home. Even Chinese mosques look very Chinese. And this leads us to 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Obviously, politically, things would change. One of the things that the People's Republic of China tried to do was to classify and bring some order and cohesion to the various different nationalities that lived under the government. So the mainstream, the majority nationality, are the Han people, who account for about 92% or 91% of the Chinese population. But then in addition to that, there are 55 different minority nationality groups who account for about 9% of the population. And these different groups are identified based on where they live, their territoriality, what language they speak, what kind of livelihood they pursue. Are they farmers? Are they merchants? Are they fishermen? And then the final characteristic or criterion is psychological characteristics, which is a very obscure term to describe culture. And so of the 55 minority groups, 10 of them identify as Muslims. We've already encountered the Hui group, right? The Chinese-speaking Muslims. And then we have 9 other groups, beginning with the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are the people who are the majority population of the far western region of Xinjiang. And then you have these other Kazakh, Kyrgyz, Uzbek, Tatar, Salar, Buanan, Dongxiang, and Tajik. And you can see many of these names are also the names of people who live in Central Asia: Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. So you can see that there's a very close relationship between these non-Chinese minorities and Islamic cultures outside of China. So how did these people become part of China? Mostly through conquest and annexation. Their lands became incorporated into the Chinese Empire, and therefore these populations became part of China as well. These are just some images to show you the different nationalities, the minorities. And we'll focus just a little bit on this group, the Uyghurs, because they are the second largest group of Muslims in China, just after the Hui. And they actually have a very ancient history, the Uyghur people. And at one time, they had a huge empire in the 9th century, an empire that was even larger than the Tang Empire and was allied with the Tang Empire. But they were not Muslim at that time. The official religion of the Uyghur Empire was an Iranian religion called Manichaeism. But then after they were defeated by other tribal groups, the Kyrgyz, many of them fled to this region to the west of Mongolia, which we now call Xinjiang. This region, and as you can see, there are many cities there. Most of this region is desert. And so people don't really live in the large spaces, but rather they live in these towns and cities, which are oases in the desert. One of the main cities, very strong center of Uyghur culture and now Islamic culture since the 10th century, is Kashgar. So you can see even from the architecture, this is a very Central Asian, Persian influenced local culture. The Uyghurs have not been independent since they had their empire in the Tang Dynasty, but there were moments of Uyghur independence just for a very short time in the mid-20th century. There was an East Turkestan Republic for 1 year, 1933 to 1934, and then a second East Turkestan Republic from 1944 to 1949. But then the People's Republic of China entered Xinjiang and claimed that territory as part of China. And China has always maintained, the Chinese government, Communist Party, has maintained that it has very good relations with the local people, with the Uyghur people. But then we also see today things like this, a sign urging women not to wear the hijab, not to veil themselves in public, saying that this is not a civilized behavior. But as I said, the People's Republic of China does say that it protects the lawful rights and interests of all the minority nationalities and upholds and develops the relationship of equality, unity, and mutual assistance among China's nationalities. It says that discrimination against and oppression of any nationality are prohibited, and that any acts to undermine the unity of the nationalities or instigate their secession are prohibited. So, in theory, the Uyghur and the other minority nationalities are allowed to live according to their own cultural norms and habits, but the government also reserves the right to interpret which actions are threatening to the sovereignty and the harmony of Chinese society. And so we have seen instances of people who have advocated for greater autonomy or even independence for Uyghur people. And most of those people are secular or culturally Muslim. But we do see a small segment of the population who speaks of establishing Uyghur independence using the terms and the language of Islamic extremism. Okay, what we might call Islamicism or fundamentalism, militant jihadism. There are people who advocate for that. And that's why we've even seen that there have been Uyghurs and other Chinese citizens who were included in the war in Syria. They actually went to fight in Syria on the side of ISIS. But at home in China, there has also been great tension, even not on religious terms, but just on socio-economic and political terms between the Han majority population and the Chinese government on one hand, and the Uyghur people who feel that their culture and their identity is being suppressed and that they are being oppressed. by the state. And this led, very unfortunately, to some terrorist attacks, like the Kunming railway station attack in 2014. And so this has led to an increase in state security, police action in Xinjiang, surveillance throughout the region. And most recently, since about 2017, China has instituted a policy of trying to eliminate extremism through re-education. That is what the government policy initiative says, that there are too many extremists among the Uyghur population, many of them religious extremists, who threaten the sovereignty and the integrity of the People's Republic of China, and therefore must be detained, arrested, tried in many cases, and re-educated so that they become better citizens of China. But many of them have just been detained for years, and others have disappeared. We don't know what has happened to such a large number of people. But the estimate is that there are as many as 2 million Uyghur people who are now detained in these camps. And so this shows that China has a problem on its borders, because it has 3 different minority groups who live in the regions to its north and to its west, who identify themselves as being a distinct people, whether it's the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, the Tibetans in Tibet, or the Mongolians of Inner Mongolia. And this causes a problem politically and economically, because China's main foreign policy initiative today is the so-called Belt and Road Initiative, for China to build infrastructure and commercial relations with its bordering countries and far beyond into Europe and Southeast Asia. But this means that it has to secure its own borders. It has to have a peaceful boundary or frontiers between itself and its neighbors. And that is something that is perhaps threatened by the situation in Xinjiang. So actually, we're running out of time right now. And I do want to have time for discussion. So very quickly, I was going to talk about China's relations with some of the Muslim countries around it. But I'm going to kind of speed through this and just maybe go through it very quickly. One very important partner for China is the Islamic Republic of Iran. And there's a long history of relations between Persia or Iran and China. This goes back all the way to the Tang Dynasty or earlier. Chinese cooperation with Iran in their nuclear program is a great concern to especially the Western powers, and military collaboration as well. Then we have the China-Turkey relationship. Again, trying to be cooperative partners, but because the Turkish people believe that they have a great affinity and relationship, in fact, a genetic relationship, if not only cultural, to the Uyghur people, there has been a cooling of relations between China and Turkey at different times in the last 10 to 15 years, because the Turkish population supports the Uyghurs. So while some people say that the Uyghurs could bridge China and Turkey, we also see that there have been protests in Turkey against the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. Then we have the Saudi-Chinese relationship, which this statistic is already 13 years old, but you can see that Chinese-Saudi trade exceeded 43 billion US dollars. By far the biggest trade partnership that Saudi Arabia has is with China. And this is especially in the area of fossil fuels, oil, petroleum, gas, but also infrastructure and now even strategic cooperation. And one of the ways that this relationship has been solidified is through what we call Hajj diplomacy. That means allowing Chinese Muslims to go and perform the pilgrimage in Mecca. So what we see is that in the year 2012, there were as many as 13,800 Chinese pilgrims who went to Mecca that year. But I will tell you that in recent years, that number has been getting smaller and smaller, largely because of Chinese policies trying to restrict foreign influence coming into China, especially among the Muslim population. But this has also meant that Salafism, this very conservative, you might say puritanical movement within Islam, has also penetrated China. And this is of great concern also to the Chinese government. So the Chinese government, just as we saw that it protects the rights of minorities in the constitution, the Chinese constitution also says that people are free to believe in any religion or no religion in China. There is the freedom of belief, and the state will not interfere with it. The state protects normal religious activities. How do you interpret what is normal, however? And it says that no one may make use of religion to engage in activities that disrupt public order, impair the health of citizens, or interfere with the educational system of China, of the state. And this is where things have become kind of difficult. When we look at the history of Islam in China, we see that there was a great tendency towards Chinese Muslims becoming more and more Chinese, Sinicization. But over the years, we've also seen an increasing influence coming from outside, from the Islamic world. So if we look at this mosque in Xi'an, the great mosque of Xi'an, it looks like a Chinese temple, the architectural style. But in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s, the new mosques that were built looked like this. And so we have this tension between Sinicization, becoming more Chinese, and then Arabization, right? More and more influence coming from the Arab world or other parts of the Islamic world. So these are some old mosques. This is the Huaisheng Mosque in Guangzhou, also rebuilt to look like a Chinese temple in the Ming Dynasty. But if you look in the background, you see a minaret that looks very Middle Eastern. Here's the mosque in Xi'an once again, the Niujie Mosque in Beijing. These all are highly Sinicized. Here's the main prayer hall in Beijing. But the mosques that were built, as I said, in the last 20 to 30 years have these features. And what do you see that they have in common? They all have green domes, reminiscent of the green dome at the Prophet's mosque in Medina. So it's a very strong Arab influence. And this has led to fears that China is becoming Islamized, that there's too much Arab or Muslim influence coming from outside of China and influencing China. And so in recent years, there has been a policy initiative and a campaign to remove that Arabic influence from the Muslim communities in China. In particular, de-Arabization of the word halal. You know, not to use Arabic calligraphy, not to use Arabic, the word halal, in fact, but only to use the word Xinjiang. So the removal of Arabic from restaurants and businesses, as you can see. So all of these signs that originally had some kind of Arabic on them have been replaced and eliminated. And now only Xinjiang by itself is acceptable to identify a Muslim business or institution. This is what we call the policy of Sinicization, an attempt to root out foreign influences and make Islam more Chinese and make Muslims more assimilated into the mainstream Chinese society. A policy directly initiated by President Xi Jinping himself. And in the most extreme cases today, we see that any kind of architecture or ornamentation or language that indicates a foreign influence is being eliminated and replaced by only Chinese. This is the same mosque, the way that it used to look since the time it was first built. And then within the last 2 years, it has been remodeled, and you see how it looks today on the right-hand side. That's what I want to share with you today. I think we're still within our time to be able to have some questions if you wish.
Jazakallah for the presentation. I see someone raise their hand. You're free to open your mic to ask questions or use the chat box.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, Professor James. I'm Nihan.
Hi, Nihan. Assalamu alaikum.
So I have a question regarding China's method of identifying Muslims. So as a large country with a population of 1.4 billion and 56 ethnic minorities, I think China seems to have great flaws in identifying ethnic groups and beliefs. So let's take halal canteens as example. Like many universities in China, they have halal canteens, but they're only open to specific Muslim minorities because ethnicity and religion they're bound together in China. So I think this ignores Han converts, the Han Chinese converts and other converts from other ethnic minorities. And another example is that in terms of the funerals, China began to promote the cremation many years ago, and they only allows the burials of ethnic minorities such as the Hui Muslims and the Uyghurs. So I think this is also ignores other Muslim converts like who do not belong to this ethnic minority. So can we say like China as a huge country, as a large country that claims to be multi-ethnic and diverse has actually ignored the religious needs of other people?
Thank you for this question. It is obviously, there's no simple answer for, because China, I think, since its establishment, the People's Republic of China has been grappling with this idea and grappling with this problem of diversity and trying somehow to be able to contain all of this diversity within, the power structure of the state. So, very early in the history of the Chinese People's Republic, there was an attempt to try to classify and to be able to identify and then also to control the different minority groups. But of course, as you pointed out, Nihan, this is not a perfect system. It was actually a very, very flawed system because, as I mentioned, there were 4 criteria in order to identify a minority group. One was their territory. The second is their economic life. The third is their language. And the fourth is their culture or psychological characteristics. Well, in the case of Muslims, especially the Hui Muslims, they don't live in one place. They live everywhere. In terms of their livelihood, some of them are peasants, some of them are merchants, some of them are doctors, lawyers, and everything in between. And in terms of language, they speak Han Chinese. So the only thing left to identify them is what is called psychological characteristics, which really means religion in this context, because it's only Islam that distinguishes the Hui from, let's say, the Han Chinese. But that becomes a problem. If you only identify people according to their religion in a country that doesn't recognize religion as being a valid identification, then a lot of people are not going to get counted properly. They're not going to be identified the way that they themselves want to be identified. And that includes Han Chinese who become Muslim, right? So what happens to a Han Chinese who becomes Muslim? Well, a Han Chinese who becomes Christian, for example, or who becomes Buddhist is still Han Chinese. But a Han Chinese who becomes Muslim, do they then become part of the Hui because they share the same psychological characteristics, because they have the same religion? Well, no, they don't. Their identity card is still going to say Han, and it won't say Hui because they're not historically a member of that Hui ethnic group. So that's the problem, is that the ethnic classification, which in the case of the Hui has to rely on a religious identity, therefore there's an overlap and a confusion between ethnic identity and religious identity, so that if your card says Hui, or if your card says Uyghur or Kazakh, yeah, you can go to the halal canteen, but the Chinese system of classifying its citizens has no way of being able to account for or identify people who change their religion just because of their own conviction and their own faith. There's no way to account for that because the state doesn't recognize religion as an identity. So I think you're absolutely right. I think I'm just repeating what you said, but maybe providing a little bit more historical background for it.
Okay, thank you, Professor. And I actually have another question, which is about the niqab. So I know there are many different opinions about the niqab, but I think niqab is like a personal choice. And even though we know like there are many Western countries such as Belgium and France, they have banned niqab, but it seems like that in other countries you're just going to be fined if you wear niqab. But in China, wearing niqab may affect your personal safety, or it might lead you to a prison sentence. So so does this behavior count as a violation of religious freedom by China? Or like how do we explain this behavior committed by China? Because China seems to associate niqab with terrorism and extremism very often. So I just cannot figure it out. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so everyone knows what niqab is, right? That's the face covering. It's not the same as hijab, which is the covering, the traditional interpretation of what the Sunnah teaches that women should cover. Nowhere in the Islamic sources does it say that one has to cover the face. And in fact, of course, during the Hajj, for example, it's not permitted to cover your face. So it would be very hard to argue that the niqab is a religious obligation. But as Nihan said, it is often regarded as a personal choice. Some Muslims think that it is a more pious, more modest way of presenting oneself. But what we have seen, of course, in some societies, because even the hijab is considered to be objectionable, because in France, in the case of France, the French government has determined that this is a mark of oppression of women, and so that women should not be allowed to wear it in public. Some would also say it's discrimination against Islamic practice. And this is clearly the case that we see in China, and it's not only niqab, it's also hijab. Even for men, wearing a beard or wearing a kufi has now been associated with religious extremism. So things that many Muslims take for granted within their own cultures as normal cultural and religious practices have been outlawed in China and also in some other places. Now, the Chinese government would say, no, we protect the rights of people to, to practice and believe in their religion. But if you remember the phrase in the Chinese constitution that I showed you, it says that normal religious activities are protected. Well, as I said, that leaves open a very wide space for interpretation. Who gets to define what is normal religious behavior for Muslims? Is it Muslims themselves? Or is it the government of a country that is officially atheist and very critical of religion, and then in more recent years has identified religion with extremism and terrorism? This is obviously a very big problem. Can Muslims accept his decisions about their own religious practice being made by people who do not share their religion? And yet, Muslims in China have no choice in many cases but to accept these judgments and these rulings coming from the Communist Party, because the Communist Party has all the power and it controls the way people live their lives. In its defense, the Chinese government would say that it is trying to promote social harmony, peace, and national security by restricting some of these behaviors. And we've seen similar arguments. For example, you cannot wear a niqab in an airport when you're going through a security check anywhere in the world. Okay? The reason for this, of course, is that you could use that clothing to disguise or to conceal some kind of dangerous apparatus, a weapon, etc. So we do make certain concessions and compromises for public safety. But China, the Chinese government, has argued that any of these religious behaviors, whether it's the niqab or the hijab or jilbab, or, as I said, even a man wearing a beard, these things have become identified with extreme and militant and even terrorist activities. So China has said, this is being banned for the security of the Chinese nation. So it's very hard to argue against that when the ones who are making that claim hold the power of the state. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's the reason for it. I actually think that it is, that the Chinese government is so interested in promoting security that it actually restricts some very basic civil and human rights.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Professor, we have more questions in the chat box.
Let me take a look.
Yes.
Okay, so Rabia Minhaj asks or says, we are uni students in China. We were asked not to pray in the library. Does performing salat in public violate Chinese law? Well, as I said, in the constitution, the Chinese government has the right to define and to classify behavior as either being legal or illegal based on its own interpretations of what is either promoting or threatening public security. So I believe that the authorities in the university, I don't know which university exactly, but I do think in most places, yeah, it's not considered to be appropriate to do kind of religious practices in a public space. They would say you have your own places to be able to perform your religious practices. There are mosques and there may be prayer rooms on campus. And they would say it's not appropriate to do it in the library because it can create public disturbance. So in that case, I would say, yes, this does violate Chinese law, or at least the regulations of that public institution, like the university. And then I see Rabia asked a second question: should we stand against the oppression of Uyghur Muslims? Well, simple answer is yes. We should stand against the oppression of any people. We should stand against the oppression of even as I said, any people. If there's a Christian minority in a Muslim country who's being oppressed, we should also stand against the oppression of that Christian minority. But of course, as Muslims, we know that we have a duty to stand against any oppression or any victimization of fellow Muslims. And so Uyghurs, the majority of them are Muslims. So as the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, when you witness injustice, you should try to change it. You should try to remove it. And if your first action should be to remove it with your hands, like to actually act against that injustice, that oppression. If you cannot do that, if you are unable to make a physical change, then you should speak out against it. Use your tongue, use your mouth, your words. But in some cases, it may be dangerous for you even to speak out, in which case the Prophet said, if you cannot use your hand and you cannot use your tongue, then you must feel it in your heart. Because that's the minimal amount of faith of a Muslim, is to feel that injustice and to stand against it in principle. So it all depends on our circumstances. Obviously, the Uyghurs themselves, they cannot do most of that action because of the severe restrictions in their homeland. But if we come from a place where we are able to speak out, where we are able to write, where we are able to communicate with our own governments, then we should take advantage of that freedom to be able to make clear that this is an international crisis. Just as people speak out against the crisis in Palestine or in Ukraine or anywhere else in the world. So my opinion is, yes, we should stand against the oppression, but we have to keep in mind that sometimes our actions may bring danger to us or to other people. So we have to be very cautious and very prudent in the type of stand that we take against oppression, making sure that it doesn't cause greater danger or harm to anyone. That's just my opinion. Okay, I see a message from Mr. Chan, Yingtai. It says, is the situation that Islam has developed and faced in terms of life and ideology after the Qing dynasty similar to that in other countries around the world or in the past? Well, again, that's a very, very broad question, asking about the whole world and all of world history. But I would say that, yes, there are similar examples that Muslims and Islam as a tradition have faced that are similar to what has happened in China. This is especially significant in places where Muslims live as a minority, right? Muslims in China have always been a minority, and therefore much of their life has been determined by the mainstream society and culture and the government, the state under which they live. And so this is very similar if we look at Muslims living in Russia, for example, or Muslims living in India, where they represent a large but still minority population. And one might make the argument that Muslims have faced similar challenges and threats, even in what we call the developed world, the Western liberal democratic world. Throughout Europe, there have always been tensions between Muslim populations and the mainstream, let's say, Christian, or at least nominally Christian society. In the United States, I mean, we saw at the beginning of the Trump presidency an attempt to ban migration or entry of Muslims into the United States. you know, these kind of restrictions, these kind of actions are not unique to China. Okay. But China just happens to be a very visible and very powerful example of what happens when a minority is marginalized, and also when it has been stigmatized or suspected of being so different that it cannot live harmoniously with the majority. So I think that answers the question. Even the second question, you said, there are places in the world that have similar situations. Similar, but not quite the same. You know, in France, if a woman wears the hijab in public, she will be fined a penalty, as Nihan said earlier, but she will not be put into prison necessarily. There is no situation in any other country that I know of right now. Well, that's not entirely true. If you look at the country of Myanmar, Burma, there have been camps where the Muslim minority population, the Rohingya people, have been kept in camps, but those were more like refugee camps because they were displaced by violence in their home territories. But the situation in Xinjiang seems to be quite different. This is at such a scale, such a large number, you know, over 1 million people being held in camps for so-called political or religious re-education, cultural re-education. It's just such a large concentration of people that I don't think that right now in the world there's anything quite like that.
Sakala, for answering the questions. Is there any more questions any participant would like to raise? I think if not, we could end the session here for today.
Okay.
The next week's session will be Stories of Prophets, presented by Sister Fiza Khan. It will be the same time on Saturday, and see you all next week. Thank you all for coming.
Assalamu alaikum.
No problem.